Thank you so much for coming. We're really pleased to welcome John Knight here today. So he is going to do obviously a talk here, and then we have an exhibition of John's work entitled Special Duties in the Gallery. So right after the artist talk, you're welcome to roll on down to the gallery, and the reception will be there from 5 until 7, and there will be a gallery conversation, which means John will have an opportunity to, and yourself, to be in the space, answering questions or talking about what's particularly happening with this exhibition. So please think about continuing to join us. There'll be food, if that's a draw. There's also, so I'm gonna start here. John Knight is a Montana-based conceptual artist and independent curator. His work is often site-specific and concerned with the intersection of architecture, design, and class. Knight recently presented a solo project internationally in 2021 in the Basement Gallery in Germany. In the United States, he has exhibited solo and two-person projects at the Montana Artist Refuge Gallery in Basin, the Window Mine and the Holland Project in Reno, Final Hot Desert in Salt Lake City, Private Places and Muscle Beach in Portland, the American Institute of Thoughts and Feelings in Arizona. I decided I wanted to read these because I think once I got into them, I was like, wow, all these places sound so interesting, you know? So, I mean, they're places I'm like, man, I need to go check these out. Julius Caesar in Chicago. Knight has initiated various artist-run spaces and curatorial projects, including the Williamson and Knight Gallery, Cherry and Blue Cheech, and H. Clune Fine Arts in Portland, the Pink House and Bad Reputation in California, and he was the 2021 curator in residence with the Open Air Residency in Western Montana. So let's all give a round of applause.
I'm going to sit just because it's a little easier to be at the computer. I hope that's okay with you all. Thank you all for having me here today. I'd like to thank Robin and Jody for initiating many visits to Billings and lectures as well. I was out here in April. I curated the student exhibition that happened in April, I believe. And I just love coming to Billings. It's such a great town. It reminds me of a Midwestern city like Cincinnati, where I'm from. It kind of has that vibe and that air about it, and I really love visiting out here. I also want to thank Nina and Heather, who are the gallery assistants, for helping me out so much in the past 48 hours. I drove in at 10 a.m. I arrived yesterday and installed the exhibition with their help, and it's been a whirlwind, and I couldn't have done it without their help, so thank you for that as well. So I'm going to start. This was just kind of a fall image. You'll notice the image on the right is in the exhibition. I'll explain it later at my 6 o'clock talk. I've been told that that's pretty blurry, so I'm going to just read from what I have here. I think I should explain that I'm really interested in the idea of degree zero when it comes to art that is without language, kind of at its basic form and what that means and how we move around that. So I'm going to just say that, and I'm going to read this text to you all. It's by an artist, Stephen Perino. He was a postmodernist painter from the 80s and 90s who passed away in the early 2000s. And this essay, or poem, however you want to call it, is called Toward Expanding the Postmodern, after Robert Smithson. Excuse me. Toward an allegory of the chaotic, toward an anti-systemic, toward a process church of the final judgment, toward a collapse of history, toward an abstraction of apocalyptic vision, toward a responsible anarchy, toward a structure and dissolve, toward a stealth satanic, toward a post-punk existential, toward a supersession, toward a psychedelic meltdown, toward a hall of mirrors, toward a totality of effect, toward a resistant resonance. So I think a lot about punk spaces and queer clubs and kind of these areas of utopia that exist within the periphery. And I read that poem to you all because Stephen Perino really kind of thought about biker culture, punk culture, rock and roll, and how art moved in and outside of those kind of scenes from the 60s onwards, and how we aestheticize this idea of kind of a moment of utopia or dystopia, whatever you want to call it. Often those spaces are just temporary. This is a photo of me, maybe age 14 or 15, in a basement in Cincinnati, Ohio, at a punk show that an old friend sent to me. But I think about this type of space a lot, the movement that happens around in that space, the gestures that come out of it, the sounds, all of that. And that's really kind of the building block that I see my practice with, coming from my experience within punk and within leftist activist politics as well. So I'm just gonna frame the conversation with that. I'm often asked what artists I think about, and my answer is more I think about poetry right now. On the left is Spoon Jackson, an incarcerated poet in Southern California. The poetry of the oppressed, the incarcerated is really important to me. Those voices, I think, bring up a lot of what's happening in our world and culture, and I like to pay attention to that. The middle is Ingrid Junker. She was a South African or Afrikaner poet in the 50s and 60s, dissident poet. And then on the right is Arturo Giovannetti, who led the Lawrence textile strikes in 1913. Does anyone know what the Lawrence textile strikes were in the United States? It's the Bread and Roses strikes. It's where women rose up in Lawrence, Massachusetts, to ask for better working conditions and better wages. They were working 80-hour days, and the average age for a woman at that time, lifespan was 29 years old. And it was a strike that was organized by the IWW, the International Workers of the World. I'm interested in Arturo for that, but because he comes from the same ancestral hometown that my great-grandfather comes from in southern Italy. It's a town of 400 people. So I have this narrative in my mind that they were like childhood friends, and somehow I get my political leanings from that friendship. That's totally a fiction, but that's the way that I like to exist and think about him. So, and he produced one book in his lifetime, and Helen Keller wrote the foreword of that book. So he was quite prolific when he was alive. So, but kind of lost to history at this point. This is Marcia Hafif. She just passed away a few years ago. Her career is this: it's monochrome painting, it's degree zero painting, it's painting that thinks about color, brush stroke, and is that enough for a conceptual practice? I'm just bringing this one image up to show you, an artist that I'm thinking about that influences my work. This gallery space is in Chicago. It's my friend Eric's space. It's called Rushman Gallery. He's partners with my friend Matt. Later on, you'll see a project in my presentation that I did with Matt. Matt and Eric started a gallery in Cincinnati when I was an undergrad, now have successful careers in Chicago. And I've had the privilege to work with them for the past 10 years. To me, that's all about community. And I bring that up as well because community comes into play for me a lot as well. So, any questions? I want this to feel pretty natural. So if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. I'm happy to answer those. Okay, we'll go from there. I also broke my presentation down into two parts. We'll have a bunch of slides on past projects, and then we'll have a bunch of slides on my curatorial projects. And I think that you'll see, hopefully if I can explain it all, you'll see how they weave in and out and how they guide the work that's downstairs. This was a project in Portland called No Half Measures. That's a term taken from chronology of anarchist actions that happened in the 70s and 80s in Italy during the years of lead. And no half measures means committing to your politics. I just think it's a very poetic title and a poetic term. But in the gallery space are three sets of objects. On the left, lumber that was stolen from a hardware store. There was a time in my life that I operated a little differently than I do now when it comes to how I get my objects that I work with. The objects in the center are vandalized political signs. I had a studio in Portland, Oregon that was above a political office, and I started to notice these piles of signs that were piling up, and I started to take that as a material to use. They're blacked out. I won't tell you who it is. 2016 is when the show happened, when I was and then on the right are objects that are what I call expropriated from construction sites, specifically construction sites where condos are being built in gentrified neighborhoods in Portland, where I lived. The color scheme is somewhat asceticized from anarchist and communist groups, just black, red, and yellow. So that's how I selected those colors. I'll back up a little. What you get with the exhibition, though, in this small space is kind of a threshold that you go through, right? You have this garage door gallery space. You walk into it, and then there's a stage. For kind of the high-end, like heady conceptual art crowd, that's where the experience ended in this space. For the children that came into the exhibition, they climbed onto that stage. And once they realized that they could climb onto that stage, that was nice that fellow did that. Once they climbed onto the stage, they realized that they could move the objects around. And my friend Taryn's children at one point asked me if there was any rules, and I said no. I'm not gonna tell you what you can or can't do in this space. And so much to the horror of a lot of the audience, they were play fighting with all of the objects on the stage, and it was this like very Shakespearean moment. But I bring all of that up because I've worked in and out of the art world for the past 15 years. I've owned 2 galleries. I've been the chief preparator at a gallery, at a blue chip gallery. I've been a registrar at a museum. I'm always thinking about how objects have kind of an aura and a luxury value around them, and what happens when we start to strip that away and we give permission to touch an object, or how we present that. What does that mean to the object? Does it have a different relationship to the audience? So that was a very kind of interesting, within the context of this exhibition, interesting like kind of theater of relations that was at stake, that was happening. On the left is an essay. I hired a friend to write an essay for the show, and it's kind of this, you can't read it, and I'm sorry, but it's this kind of existential exercise about what's happening in the space. And then he presented it as an invoice to me. I was gonna pay him, but he presented it as an invoice for his labor. And then that invoice got mailed to the gallery's mailing list. So it was just this kind of secondary poetic moment that was happening with the exhibition that helped frame the total thing that was the show for the project. I will say that the stage was also, I worked with a construction firm to take some other materials. They didn't want to throw it away, so I came with a U-Haul and took a pile of wood, and they donated it to this project. So it's construction barriers that would be used for pathways through the city or for walling up a building, that sort of thing. So all of the graffiti on it, it's just from the environment, and I'm appropriating it and claiming it as my own. This is a show in Portland called Pig. I'll go to the next exhibition. I worked for 2 years with school children to make a series of paintings. The only condition was I kept reading them this Roald Dahl poem about a pig who is comfortable on a farm until he realizes he's going to be slaughtered for his meat. And so the way that he deals with this situation is he kills the farmer and consumes the farmer. It's this like insane, like anti-capitalist children's poem. And it's really graphic and weird. Go right ahead.
How old were the children you were working with?
They're second graders.
Second graders?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I was lucky. I had friends that were teachers that just gave me access, and we gave permission slips to the parents, and all the parents were okay with this exercise that was happening. So basically, I directed some sort of labor that would happen within the gallery, and the children made my paintings. I say made my paintings because I then appropriated their work and made these giant banners that would get unfurled at the outside of this gallery space. And Jade right here is one of the curators of that space, and I had a requirement that as they're unfurled, she's reading the audience the poem that was given to the children. But this is a show happening completely outside of the exhibition space. I'm not making any of the work. I'm just appropriating all of the labor and calling it my own. Highly problematic, I suppose. But in the writing and the text for that exhibition, all of that was admitted to and talked about on purpose to have some clarity around that. So here's just a couple more images of that. They're these wonderful 16-foot long, messy children's paintings that I love. So that's my friend Joe and his daughter Ray who's hanging on, which I think that's a really funny image. There's one more. Ideas of labor and who's making the work is also a thing that I'm thinking about and playing with a lot. This show identity value. Well, how about I back up? There's a really well-known conceptual artist named John Knight. We spell our names the same way. He's in his late 70s. He's based out of LA. And he's kind of the canon with conceptual art, American conceptual art. He had a project in the 90s in New York City of floral arrangements at American Fine Arts Company in 1998. Where he went into different restaurants around Soho and borrowed their floral arrangements in the restaurants and took them out of the restaurant and placed them as sculptures in the gallery space, and then replaced them with a plaque saying what had happened. My grandmother was a floral designer on the side of being a homemaker. She wrote 2 books in the 50s and 60s on how to make floral arrangements and won a bunch of awards doing so. I never knew her. She passed before I was born, but these books are kind of my connection to who she was. So I hired my mom, who in retirement has decided to become a floral arranger, to make a grouping of works out of the book of my grandmother's that I would call my own sculptures in the gallery space in relationship to the John Knight exhibition that had happened in the 90s as well. Very complicated, lots of weird entry points and doors there. So these are all sculptures that were presented on the gallery floor. Very tiny gallery space. This is Julius Caesar in Chicago. And in the back room, you'll see a gallerist. My friend Matt, who I talked about earlier, presented a series of perfumes based off of his family members that the gallerist would have to wear during the opening. So there's 4 people that run the space, and they're all positioned behind the gallery, and you'd go up to them and smell them and have a scent based off of his memory of his family. So complicated and weird, right? So you'd move into the space and you'd be in relationship, with these arrangements. There's some heirlooms taken, from my parents' basement that hold the flowers as well. Up until maybe 2 hours before the opening happened, my mom and I were on the floor putting everything together and having this nice moment together. There's also these little placards right here. You can't really see it, but on the front, there is a number that might say 48 on it, and that's in reference to the number of the floral arrangement in the book that I'm referring to. And that book was also on display, so the audience could, kind of locate where the work's coming from. On the backside, letterpressed, was the signature of my grandmother from one of her books, my mom's signature, and the other John Knight signature, letterpressed onto the back of the card. So it's their signatures I'm claiming as my own, and in the claiming of this work as mine. So throughout the run of the show, the flowers deteriorated. So there was this really beautiful thing happening of the flowers dying. So you would come in a month later, dead flowers on the floor, and the exhibition had changed completely. So there's that project. This project called Show Title is a 2-person exhibition with my friend Nicolo. This happened in Granite City, Illinois. Granite City, interestingly enough, is the closest place right now in Illinois that you can get an abortion if you're coming over from St. Louis. So it's turned into this really political place in the past 6 months, which is strange and interesting. Granite City has a really old steel mill just across the street from this gallery. So I was thinking a lot about that steel mill and this gallery being in this part of town that's run down but slowly gentrifying. Artists are moving there. Punk clubs are opening up, galleries are opening up, and what that means for me to come in and to have an exhibition. Nicolo, on the other hand, kind of exists within queer and gay culture and kind of the imagery around that and the history around that. So we were thinking about punk and queer culture kind of collide at times within the cityscape that they're in. What happens if we bring our two kind of bodies of work and thinking together in that space? So the curtain is Nicolo. The wall paintings, literally rolled out paint on a wall, is mine, and the text on the wall is mine as well. The text on the wall was called the conic phrase, and it was work at the factory, join the army, or go to prison. And that's a phrase growing up that me and my friends had in the back of our mind and would joke about when asked what we were going to do with our lives. And having not much context for the outside world, outside of the working class, suburb in Cincinnati we came from, those seemed like the options. I worked at the factory my dad worked at when I turned 18. Friends of mine went off to Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 2000s. Other friends went to prison. So that phrase is very real in my mind and could have been options for me. I feel very lucky that I got into punk and into activism and decided to go to art school at some point, and it kind of shifted my framework of thinking in the world. Robin at one point said that I'm an anti-art artist to someone, and again, I think about visuality, not the object all of the time. So what does it mean that there's painting on the wall? You can't take the object away, that the painting gets painted over with after the exhibition, and how do we place value around that? So those decisions are being thought about with an exhibition like this. The typeface of the text mirrors the typeface of the Granite Works steel factory across the street. And then this presentation of the wall painting you find in kind of industrial spaces, that kind of half wall painting you find in factories or hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to mirror that to a degree as well. Color scheme goes back to what I was saying about the previous project as well. And then on the ground right there is a leather jacket that is actually waxed that Nicolo cast, and there's candles burning throughout the exhibition in that leather jacket. And Nicolo was thinking a lot about the AIDS and HIV epidemic, coming out of these spaces as well, but being 40 years, 30 years beyond that and what that means for that history as well. So it's interesting, right? On one half, I'm an artist that's working very anti-material, very anti-craft, and Nicolo is coming in and dealing with material in a very fine, manner. And when we collapse the two together, what does that mean to the audience, and how do they move around the work? Those are just questions for me. So, and then that curtain you can pass through, so you're passing through the two lovers kissing. So, yeah. And then that's just a nice photo of the sun setting. So, there you go. I'll say, interestingly enough, even though the factory is right over there too, that's also a VFW hall right there. And during the opening, two older men wandered over, not knowing what the space was. And it was just wonderful to have a conversation with them, and invited me and the curator to have drinks at the VFW hall afterwards, where we met so many wonderful community members that would never go into an art exhibition. That feels really important to me, that different classes, different peoples with different backgrounds can enter an exhibition and be in collaboration with each other and in conversation with each other. So that was a really nice moment that came out of this exhibition. This is a project that just happened in Basin, Montana. It opened in early September and closed in late October. So it's fresh on my mind. This is an abandoned jail behind the Montana Artist Refuge Gallery in Basin, Montana. Basin sits between Butte and Helena, and in the late 70s, a bunch of artists and poets moved to Basin and somewhat homesteaded. They're still there. And in the early 90s, they opened a gallery and an artist residency that you all can apply for and go to. They went away for a couple years, but now they're back up and running again. I was invited out with another artist to show at the gallery. The other artist, Stephen Hunt, showed in the White Wall Gallery space, and his photographs are of landscapes. And he's an indigenous artist, so he thinks a lot about the land and all of that. And I showed in the back space, what I was calling the auxiliary space. It was open the entire time. The jail never closed, so the community, whoever traveling through, could go into that space at all hours, which also poses a risk to the work, right? There's weather coming through the bars. You'll see, windows that weather can go through, all of that. So it's an interesting space to have work in. Similarly to the works downstairs, there's about 20 layers of pigment and paint on the surfaces of the paintings. They're very process-based. And behind each painting, there would be pigment that's in relationship to the graffiti on the wall. So kind of thinking about the space and using that as a way to just put mark and color down on the canvas. But then whitewashed out. You go into a city, you'll see in this space, if you were to ever go into it, there's graffiti that's whitewashed and then graffiti on top of that and whitewashed. It's this kind of dance between, city workers or private company workers or security and people moving through and making marks in public spaces. So I, had that kind of gesture happening on these stretched canvases in that space and ending up with these whitewashed, very white paintings. They also, in my mind, operate as thresholds. What does it mean to be, imprisoned in this jail cell and to have these thresholds to look at? Does that open your thinking within that imprisonment? Do they act as windows, essentially? And then in the backspace, a red triangle painting. I mentioned the IWW earlier. Basin is a mining town, and it's very likely that in the 19th century, organizers of strikes, organizers of the miners could have been imprisoned in this space. So I was very aware of what that history could be and what my body in relationship to that history could be as well. So I wanted to make a painting that just thought about that to a degree. But again, using the same kind of formal techniques that I use in my work. And then there was also a wheat pasted photograph. When I moved to Montana in 2017, I couldn't find a job. So my first job was driving food delivery for a food delivery app. That's with like a terminal degree. It was the biggest ego death I've ever gone through. It was a hard time, and my partner Brittany can attest to that. I was really struggling with what I was doing in Montana. However, when I was driving for Uber Eats, I was taking a point and shoot camera with me, and I quickly figured out that if I took a wrong turn or two more and made my delivery maybe 5 minutes later, I would get a little extra money. So it became this funny gesture that I would take a wrong turn and make more money. So they became situationist derives where I would journey through the city without expectation, without direction. When I had reached the end of that 5 minute or 10 minute extra journey and knowing that I'm making more money doing that, I would document where I ended up and then I'd go deliver the food. So to me, that's a funny anti-capitalist gesture or anti-capitalist gesture functioning under the umbrella of capitalism. And then that was really just a way for me to retain some sort of artistic autonomy. I was working 7 days a week, 10 hours a day. It was hard work. A struggle for not a lot of money. So that was my first experience being in Montana, was kind of laboring that way. And I wanted to have kind of an updated version of labor in this jail cell where people that struggle for labor rights might have been imprisoned 100 years ago. So just creating some sort of a relationship there. All of that was kind of expressed and written out in the object list that we gave to the audience. I will say one more thing. This painting was stolen. It disappeared about 2 weeks into the exhibition. And then every other object or painting, the photograph was destroyed. Someone tried to scrape it off. Every painting was painted on, burned, and slashed by whoever traveled through the space. There was this great conversation that happened at the end of the exhibition in Mason, where I gave an artist talk to the residents there. And there was this idea that the work had been vandalized, but I countered that by saying, well, I left the door open. So what does that mean? Like I didn't make it a private space, so if I haven't privatized the space, are the objects private, or do they become these things that can be moved by or marked on by anyone that comes into the space? I don't know, but I really kind of strayed away from the idea of vandalism, and I find it really interesting that other people that I was not in direct communication with, other than having objects on the wall, decided to have their own relationship, albeit somewhat aggressive, to the campuses. I think maybe the really kind of poetic and beautiful way that I think about that is those aggressive marks could have happened anywhere else in the world on other bodies, and instead they happened on these thresholds, and those thresholds became kind of these takers of that aggression, and that feels really interesting to me. I've gotten these works back, and now I have these works that have different marks on them. So now I have this question of, do I claim those marks as my own and present them in a different way, in a different context? And go right ahead, yeah.
So is this at the beginning?
This is at the beginning, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I have cell phone photos of the destroyed pictures, but I'll just tell you about them. So yeah, so that's a project that just happened. I also love that the red painting could be like in someone's house. Like I love that maybe a teenager took it and snuck it into their bedroom, unbeknownst to their parents. Like that's my own narrative, who knows? But I love that it's traveled outside of the so-called gallery space into another context, and again, really makes me think about the value of the work and how I want it to function in the world. The photo on the left is just graffiti. I just think it's really nice and poetic. This is the flyer for the show in Leipzig. I think it looks really good in my opinion, so that's why it's there. The front object is an aestheticized punk stage. I decided to make a minimalist sculpture based off of my memory of a punk club in Cincinnati, Ohio called the Huskow, which is a prison in Russian. It was this punk club that I went to when I was like 14 and 15. And instead of remaking it exactly based on my memory, I made a very aestheticized version of that with a very similar color scheme to what you'll see downstairs. The second object is a flower bed. I'll go back. Is a flower bed active in the 70s in Germany were some left-wing terrorist organizations, and Leipzig is an Eastern German city. So I was very aware of the space that I was going into. And when I mean Eastern German, I mean it was a communist city. It was on the eastern side of the wall. So there is a radical politic that's still at stake and at play in Eastern Germany. There's whole city blocks that are squats full of anarchists. During my opening, there's three riots happening, 3 left-wing riots with full-on fighting with cops happening in the city, throughout the city during my opening. And that's just like the regular weekend in Leipzig from my understanding. So I was very aware of the history of that area and kind of I would say the new left, the left-wing movements from the 70s onwards. That flower bed is a remake of a gravesite of 3 Red Army faction terrorists, and the gravesites on the eastern side of Germany from after they were, they collectively committed suicide in prison, but a lot of people say they were killed by the state. So it's me looking at an image and remaking that image as a sculpture and kind of placing it as a memorial in that space. There's some details of it. And then there's this cardboard structure, and maybe you can see it better if I go back to there. You know how when you go to a big city and restaurants have these hospitality awnings, you have to pass through this awning that's in public space before you get into a restaurant. They're usually made out of fabric, but they exist on public space. They're even though they're kind of private space, they're in this in between. Leipzig is quickly gentrifying and has these hospitality awnings, so I wanted to make an object in relationship to an architecture that I saw in the city as well. But rather than, make it one-to-one with fabric and make it really aestheticized, I made it out of cardboard because like any big city in Europe or the United States, there is a houseless population that makes temporary housing like this. So I wanted to have this kind of didactic back and forth between a hospitality awning and a housing situation that one of our houseless neighbors might find themselves in. And as a whole, it just becomes this sculptural installation of these three different ideas kind of collapsed together happening in this space. Does that make sense? This is only a year old, so I'm still processing this exhibition, but this tends to be the way that I work. These like half-baked or maybe fully thought ideas kind of collapsed all together with other ideas into some sculptural or painterly moment. On the stage is this little wrist punk rocker bracelet, and this photo, which is also downstairs in my exhibition. These are of 4 people that I knew in Cincinnati that had a band, and I spent a lot of time on YouTube. I'm accused of being in my mid to late 30s and being on YouTube a lot. And I was watching a video of this band that I had seen growing up and became friends with, and I saw this really lovely moment that they're all sitting together in that video before they play. And I wanted to take that moment and insert it in the exhibition and kind of have a relationship with my own experience in literally a foreign city, and how I can relate to that city and what's happening in that city, but also the audience. And so I wanted there to be this presence of bodies that I related to. So it's wheat pasted on the wall, like you would find flyers, on the outside of a building or graffiti, I suppose. So it's wheat pasted, inkjet wheat paste, so it's not salvageable after the exhibition. And you'll see that downstairs as well. That's a strategy that I employ a lot, is wheat paste. Okay, those are some projects. Are there any questions? And I think we're doing okay with time. Am I flying through? Go right ahead.
So what even is a punk club? Because I've lived in Montana my whole life, so I don't even know what a punk club really is.
It's a place that like punk shows happen.
Okay.
And that's what I mean by it, and that space is not finite. That space is in basements, it's in living rooms, it's in Kirk's Grocery. That space, I tend to think of that space that way, where it's DIY, do it yourself. Artists, poets, musicians are coming together and being in relationship or in relation and creating moments that may or may not be political. I would say that they are political even if they're anti that, because there is this utopic thing that's about hope and about ideas being expressed. So it's a general term, and that's a great question that I'm using and throwing around. So thank you.
No,
Yeah.
thank you.
Are there any other questions about my projects? I just hit you all with a lot, but I'm gonna do a little more, and then we can go back to questions. So I'm also an independent curator. That's the best title that I can figure out to say what I do when I do curatorial projects. I've largely existed with these projects outside of for-profit galleries, but in the next project you'll see that's not totally true. This project's called Cherry Lucic. This was at the house that I lived in for many years in Portland. This house was shared by artists and musicians and street artists and all of that, and it was this great house that had a lot of energy and momentum. And when I lived there, my roommate Kyle and I and our friend Eleanor decided to take over the garage space and have a gallery in that space. Portland has this wonderful artist-run history of artists running, galleries, kind of showing their friends and creating, these moments for each other, creating their own experiences around art. So we decided to take that space over and claim it as a gallery. This project is MK Youth. I'll back up. We decided not to show a lot of our friends and instead show mid-career artists. And what I mean by that is artists that are showing in museums or at for-profit big galleries. We had some access to those artists based on all 3 of ours involvement within the art world collectively. So we decided to have this conversation with exhibitions on what it meant to bring a well-known artist back to a space like this, a space that might mirror the site of the work's production or mirror the site of an exhibition earlier in their career, but with their art having a different value around it now. So we claimed the gallery. The walls were full of rats. Those are grapevines that rotted the ceiling out of the gallery, so when it would rain, it would pour through the gallery around these expensive objects. We had like contracts with all of the artists on, you know, what that meant and that they were signing up for that type of environment. So that was the space. This is MK Guth, and this is actually the last exhibition we had. It's called The End of the Party, and you know, the situation was that as you came to the last show of Cherry and Lucic, you would take a celebratory balloon and the gallery would empty out of balloons, and then there was this poster at the end that announced the end of the party. And MK like made like a bowl of alcoholic punch, and everyone had a good time, and we had like the grill going, and it was just a nice party to mark the end of a project. This is Henry Kodak's. Henry Kodak's is actually a fake artist. It's the name of two artists working together, Olivier Mosset, who is a well-known French painter, Swiss French painter that comes out of Paris in the 60s and 70s and worked just prior to Stephen Perino, who I mentioned earlier. Olivier is well known for these white paintings with circles that he thought he was going to do for his entire career, and then he made this switch to making large-scale monochrome painting. He and Marcia Hafif come out of this moment in the early 80s in New York, where a bunch of painters painting this way started a group called the Radical Painting Group, Radical Painters. And they only had a couple exhibitions and broke up and moved on. But these were all artists thinking about the base level of painting, paint on a canvas devoid of subject matter and narrative. And so that's one half of Henry Kodak's. The other half is a younger artist named Jacob Kesse, who also works the same way. Henry Kodak's will not sign their paintings, and they'll disavow any exhibition that occurs, meaning that they decide not to author their paintings, meaning it allows a bunch of young negative punk rockers like Kyle, Eleanor, and I to stage a Henry Kodak show without permission, without telling the artist, and to sell it to the public as a Henry Kodak show, and to kind of fake it and have this collapse of expectation around it. And what I mean is no one knew that it was fake. Everyone came to the opening thinking that it was an actual Henry Kodak show until they realized the artist didn't show up, right? And then we're all moving around these fake paintings together and kind of in conversation on what that means and our expectations around art. We hired a house painter to make these. That's as simple as it gets. We had stretcher bars that were donated to us, and we stretched the canvas and hired a house painter with grant money. And at one point, you know, we were in talks with different gallerists around town about selling these on the open market for like $50,000, and that would have been like a funny gesture to have had occur as fake paintings. That never did happen. So that's one project that happened in Cherry Lucic. We were in Northeast Portland, I should say, which was rapidly gentrifying. It's a historic Black neighborhood full of artists and punk houses and all of that, and we certainly were part of that. And often when a city or a neighborhood becomes too expensive to live in, the community that's historically been there is pushed out by the artists that come in because it's cheap rent, it's cheap spaces. So they come in, and that clears the way for developers 10 years later to start to redeveloping it. I don't think I'm making that up. I think that that's pretty well documented in the past 20 or 30 years. So we worked with an artist, Paula Wilson, who's a Black artist, who's a good friend of ours. She lives down in Carrizozo, New Mexico now. But she had this video project about a beach in Florida that was gentrified eventually from the 60s onwards to being a white beach, but it had started as a Black beach. And this video is like her in the ocean painting bodies, you know, and the beach changing from Black to white essentially, and it's this really beautiful video. So we wanted to work with an artist to kind of expressively deal with that history that we're in, we were experiencing, and to acknowledge that, and to have the audience come in and acknowledge that as well. So that exhibition was literally just a wall that we built and a projection of this video that Paula had made, and it was really quite nice. It had shown previously at the Studio Museum in Harlem, so it was really nice to take it from a museum in New York City to our garage. That felt really great. When we did get grant money, we would work with artists, local artists, and act as patrons. We would pay for their paintings and give them shows and act as like these wealthy patrons. We would try to distribute the money as we could and not make money off of it. So this painting was by our friend Emily. I can't remember her last name, so it doesn't sound like she's my friend. I'm sorry. But we basically paid her for a year to make an exhibition, and she wanted to show one of her paintings on the outside of the gallery under the grapevines. So we were kind of always shifting our roles within this project and acting as gallerist, acting as fake artist, acting as dealer, and really kind of building a different relationship or meaning, I should say, on what it could mean to run an alternative art space and to play out a type of art gallery in that. Does that make sense to everyone? I might be rambling, I don't know. This show was by Arnold Joseph Kemp, who is a mentor of mine, and he's a really great friend of mine. He's now the dean of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago of Graduate Studies. I bring that up because you should always keep in touch with people that you're in conversation with, because they're going to help you out along your career. Arnold was my mentor in graduate school. We became really great friends, and when I asked him for an exhibition, he was really happy to say yes. And then we sold all the work to the Portland Art Museum on behalf of him, and he got like an 80% cut out of that. We did like an 80-20 split. So this is like the way that relationships can build over years and years is you take care of your own, your community, and you give each other shows and when opportunity arises, and hopefully build a better world from that. So I bring that up just to say that. That's really what the space looked like. It was pretty raw. It was full of trash before we took the space over. We cleared it out and had a little art gallery in it. And that line of water is, after it rained and the water pouring out and drying a little. So there you go. I said that I had never ran a for-profit gallery or a white wall gallery, but after Cherry and Lucic, a gallerist in Portland invited my friend Iris Williamson and I to take over her gallery space. She wanted out of running a business, but didn't want to give up the space that she had bought. She didn't want to give it up for something other than being a gallery. So we were invited to start a business rent-free, kind of in the gallery district of Portland, catty corner to the art gallery at that time that employed me full-time. So it allowed me to quit my job and open up shop, like literally around the block, which was a funny thing that happened. I then became a janitor at an art school because running an art gallery is really hard, which I liked that I went from working at a blue chip gallery to owning a gallery and becoming a janitor. That felt like a really nice moment. But it was this white wall space in the for-profit gallery district of Portland. And Williamson Knight, our last names. But we made a decision to show women artists, queer artists, underrepresented artists, and activist artists. Because we were in this part of town that is about selling, we wanted to see if we could start opening up a marketplace for underrepresented artists, both within the community and outside the community. This is Shada Salamini, who I went to undergrad with. She's a photographer. She teaches up in Providence, Rhode Island now. And Shada deals a lot with her Iranian American heritage background and her relatives and ancestors that, come from Iran and still are in Iran. These are all images, photo compositions of disappeared women in Iran. She spends a lot of time archiving cell phone images of women that have disappeared to let their image live on some way. And then they're used in the images that she makes. These are also Bobo dolls. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Bobo dolls. Bobo dolls were from a study in the 60s where I think it's probably highly unethical now, but the psychiatrists would have children come into a room with a doll and they would see how violent they would get with the doll, and the doll bounces down and bounces back up, that sort of thing. So this is what these are, but with these images of disappeared women. So if you come into the gallery and you hit that, what does that mean? What does that mean for the object? What does it mean for the woman who's disappeared and all of that? So that was our first exhibition in the space, and we really wanted to kind of claim the territory and the politics that we were working within while also trying to sell the work. Paula Wilson, who I talked about earlier, we kind of made this bazaar. She makes these wonderful, what look like rugs. They're paintings on wood, and the paintings, are the wood is put together in a way that they kind of fold up like rugs. Paula's partner, Mike, is like an amazing woodworker and makes a lot of the structures she works on. But when you buy one of these paintings, Paula asks that it sit on the floor and that you walk on it. So the painting, takes on marks over time and changes and looks different. So we had another show with Paula, which was really nice. This is an artist named Claire Fontaine. Claire Fontaine was a pseudonym for two artists who are partners working together. They're European artists. They're like the big time, and they're like an artist that I could only ever dream of working with. And we found ourselves in a situation that we were in communication with them somehow. I have no idea. I mean, they're like the artists that I think about the most, and they have a huge career, and they're making like anarchist work, anti-capitalist work, and then also existing on the marketplace in a funny relationship. So Claire Fontaine, named after a French notebook company that's called Claire Fontaine. Half Claire Fontaine is Fulvia. She's an Italian writer and theorist, and then James, her partner, makes all of the objects, and they produce a lot of writing and a lot of objects together. They had this exhibition in our space. The floor was wheat pasted with the week's newspaper going into the exhibition. And this exhibition was called Same Time War Zone. I'm just gonna walk you through all the objects. So there's the newspaper on the ground. And of course, in the New York Times, there's like 10 things that the New York Times likes to talk about. And usually one of those 10 things is war. So there's images of war as you walk on it. There's also this video in the back of the gallery. James had become friends with an Auschwitz survivor who was really worried that his tattoo and his number would disappear when he passed away. So the survivor asked that James carry his number on in some way. They agreed upon having his number tattooed onto his arm as a way to carry his memory and his life on in some way. So it's a video in the back of this tattoo being placed onto James's arm. That TV is like a 90-inch TV that we bought from Costco and returned in 30 days because of that policy. So because we couldn't afford a TV. And then there was this really nice artwork. Does anyone recognize where this could be referenced from by chance? There's an artist who passed away in the 90s named Felix Gonzalez Torres. He was a gay artist who died of AIDS. He had a really famous piece called Same Time Lovers, or Two Lovers, excuse me. Two lovers, and it's just two clocks set to the same time, and it was about he and his partner who had previously died of AIDS. James and Fulvia decided to remake that work and place Jerusalem and Gaza on the same time, divided literally by a wall and by apartheid. So those were the objects that were in the space, and the audience comes in and is kind of hit with the history of genocide, ongoing genocide, and the printed version of that happening on the floor through the newspaper, and the audience comes in and has an experience with that. So that was one of our projects at Williamson Night. I was also invited, I got 5 minutes before the opening, so I'll bust through real quick. Invited to curate a show in LA. I worked with a collector using his collection of early minimalist and early conceptualist objects to make an exhibition in this really tiny gallery space. Robert Watts, Ray Johnson, on the left, two early Fluxus artists, and then on the right, Anna Darboven, who was an early conceptual artist that worked in Xerox as the Xerox machine came into public use. That was her main medium. And then there was one conceptual artist, meaning still work, or contemporary artist, meaning still working of this time, who made these kind of circle pieces on the wall, Chadwick Rantanen. We decided to place newer artists with the older objects. And then Luciano Fabro, an early arte povera artist. This is a photo of him getting married in the 50s and his wedding ring. There's 250 versions of this, editions I should say, so it's, you know, kind of a copy of a copy. And then Daniel Buren photo souvenir from the 60s as well from this collector. I will say this was a show about selling artwork. The collector asked me to select work that we could find on an open marketplace in LA, and then the contemporary artist was meant to be sold to the collector. So I'm saying all these anti-capitalist weird things, right? And I'm also existing in this realm of needing to make a living and work in the art world a certain way. I was invited to be the open air curator in residence last year. This is my friend Aaron working at the Missoula Public Library last year. What I want to say about this is community. I worked with 21 artists who are now part of my expanded artist community that I'm constantly in communication with, and we're supporting each other. And I was very privileged for a year to go into studios, to be on Zoom, to be writing about their work and helping develop their work. And it culminated with 2 exhibitions, one in Butte this summer and one in Missoula, where I live, that showcased their work. So I'll bring that one up. And then this is my friend Taryn Tomasello, I was just texting with. She's in New York right now. She just had an exhibition in Portland, and she invited me to write an essay to kind of frame and contextualize her work for the exhibition. And Taryn's like one of my first friends from Portland. I lived in Portland for a decade, so I've known her for about 15 years now. So there's always this push and pull of asking and receiving, asking and supporting, whatever that is, with your friends and your community. And I say all of that in hopes that you discover that. That's about being an artist, that's about being in community with each other and really making each other's careers in community. So I think that's all I got. That's just a random artwork. The bottom of the text says, I never fantasized about it as an object, or I had never fantasized about it as that obscure object of desire that it was, and often still is for many comrades who date back to the year 1968. So anyways, I'll leave it there. That's my presentation. That was like a land speed record. And if there's any questions, like take 5 minutes and we can be a couple minutes late to the opening because I don't care. So, go right ahead.
I have a question. So in my experience, it seems like queer environments or spaces usually are the first to be gentrified.
Mm-hmm.
So in your opinion, why do you think that is?
They're the first to be gentrified. When you're using the term gentrified, do you mean by bodies that appear in the mass culture, or straight or vanilla,
Yeah, I suppose so. Or
Yeah.
just like even like monetarily, like
Mhm.
these places of like not destitute, but like definitely lower income that
Yeah.
are like high in culture
Yeah.
and community, but then change for
I feel like they're temporary spaces. I mean, we live under the framework and, the guise of capitalism. Things become sellable and become in vogue, and subculture becomes mass culture. And I think that we see that happening constantly. And I mean, I think about subculture a lot. I think that younger folks these days don't think about it because everything can be consumed. Subculture was this place that you could escape to. I became a punk because I was nerdy. I had a speech impediment. I never felt like I fit in, and I needed a place to escape. And all of a sudden, there are other weirdos in the room with me. Access to that information was hard to find, and once you found it, it was kind of protected. I think it's the same within queer and gay communities. I'm straight, so I'm only in the periphery of that. So I think it's that. But now, within kind of 2022 context, we have Instagram, we have TikTok, we have Wikipedia. we get all of the information and maybe knowledge, I don't know if information is knowledge, at our fingertips. And so I find it really lovely that kids these days can be goth one day, can be punk another day, they can look like a jock the next day, and there's these like breakdown of identities that occur with the access to information. What happens when that collapses? I don't know. Do these barriers get built back up? I'm not sure. In terms of your question, why those spaces become gentrified, I think because they become profitable, they become cool and in vogue and profitable, and someone finds a way to make money off of it. So I mean, I'm talking about like punk shit constantly, and yet there's these, punk rock festivals that are about making money and reliving an experience that, is being sold to me that I experienced when I was 15, but now I'm 36, right? So am I buying into that nostalgia or not? That's a question. So yeah, thank you. Is that an answer? It helps.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, yeah. One or two more questions? Go right ahead, yeah.
Which of the shows you talked about had the most personal significance for you?
The most personal significance, all of them, no, I'm kidding. I think the show in Germany that happened last year and the show that just happened in Basin, those two feel like the most important shows that I've had in quite a while. I think about the Muscle Beach show a lot as well because that made me realize that I could have a different relationship to audience. That's really an earlier project than most of what I showed you. That's kind of the starting point of me thinking about objects differently and watching the audience play out theater and all of that. So those three have a lot of significance. I don't know how else to answer that, but the Basin one is really fresh on my mind because again, the work was moved and played with and stolen, and that's really interesting to me. So that's really been at the back of my mind, and I feel really present with that work right now. So yeah, go right ahead. Yeah.
Follow-up question. What do you feel like you've learned most from your last show, and then how are you taking that forward in this show and the next couple?
Yeah. What I feel like I've learned for my last show in Basin was how to talk about my work, because I was forced into this position where I had to acknowledge all these things that had happened and have this really honest conversation about my viewpoint on those actions that had happened and what that meant in that space. And I realized after the couple talks that I had that I kind of found a route to talk about that work, and I hadn't been able to find a route to talk about my work in quite a while. So that was really important. With this exhibition downstairs, trusting myself, I often don't know what my work is gonna look like installed until I'm in the space. My bio earlier said site specific. What I mean by that is I'm building projects in my studio to a degree, and then I'm coming into a space and finishing that and installing based on how that architecture feels. So the work downstairs, some of that work has been worked on since the summer. Other work was literally fabricated on site yesterday when I got to the gallery. I was thinking a lot at dinner last night that I really trust myself. I trust, my mind's eye, I trust my writing, my sketches and all of that. And I've reached a point that I know how to make decisions that feel right to me. So my partner was like, well, what about the accessibility of the work? And I made some really bad comment of, I don't care what the audience says, and then I had to back up and be like, actually, I do really care, but this, these things also mean something to me, and I don't want to compromise the vision that I have for my own work, but I want to find entry points for the audience to understand what's happening in my mind. So I had to back up and explain that to my partner. She really put me on the spot right there. So does that answer your question? Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, go right ahead.
Working with the children, the project that there, once you were able to relate to them what the story was about, did you have any children reacting to that story with any trauma behind that, or tears, or?
That's a great question. I think children are so resilient. I think they can take that and move with it. There were no tears. I would say that maybe that's also an early project, and I wasn't quite aware of my own presence as an artist in that situation. I would say that some of the kind of play acting that happened in that space of the classroom became aggressive as time went on, because there was this permission over 2 years that I was given and the teachers were given to the children to play act, and it just naturally got aggressive. So as the story was retold over and over again, some of the imagery became violent and some of the interactions between the children became a little more aggressive. Which is complicated that I go in, and I mean, I have complicated feelings about creating a situation like that, you know. But you know, no kind of active like tears or breakdowns. It just, I think kids can take a story like that and deal with it and throw it all together and put it on canvas and, you know, make an image, so.
So they're expressing whatever they're feeling about the pig on
Exactly.
canvas.
Yeah. For me, that's really interesting because I could never make a painting like that. Like I don't think that I can paint in that free of a way. I'd like to think that I can, but truth is I'm very structured with my life and have processes when I make my work. And it was really important to watch these kids just like be splattered paint everywhere and being expressive, little Jackson Pollocks everywhere, you know. So that felt really important just to witness and to give space to.
Was that your hardest project?
No, I'd say the flower show was my hardest because I had family members being like, why am I not involved with that? I had a relationship with our grandmother or, you know, my aunt, whoever, and me being like, I'm sorry, like this is my mom, I'm paying my mom, we're using this book, and then family members saying you can't do that, like you can't claim that. Even my dad was like, you can't use my mom's images as your artwork, and I had to be like, I'm sorry, I can, and this is how I operate, and that caused some tension, but that moment was also creating my own relationship with a family member in that moment, so I was willing to hold that line, I should say, because it was about my own relationship, so, yeah. Go right ahead, yeah.
So how did you end up doing shows in other countries?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, straight up, it's like knowing people and being in conversation. Robin listed a show at Final Hot Desert, which is my friend Ben, who is in Salt Lake right now. He dropped out of art school 5 or 6 years ago. I'm not saying to do that, but dropped out of art school, wanted to start a gallery space, couldn't afford it, and so he started taking friends' art to the desert in southern Utah and photographing them in the desert as exhibitions, and then just like throwing it out on Instagram under the name of a gallery, Final Hot Desert. I had a show in Tucson at the American Institute of Thoughts and Feelings, and he had seen it, and he randomly messaged me on Instagram, and we were in conversation without meeting, and all, but you know, through text and on the phone and Instagram for a year, and that culminated with an exhibition that I asked to be in a gallery space in Salt Lake City. That happened, and then we remained in conversation. He's become a really good friend of mine, and we've supported each other's careers. He was in contact with this gallery in Germany. Ben moved to Germany for a while. He was invited to be a curator in Berlin, and then he was in contact with this space in Leipzig and basically asked me if I wanted to have an installation at Leipzig. So that's how that unfolded. We're still in contact. I'm gonna see Ben tomorrow when I drive through Salt Lake. Driving down to Joshua Tree for a vacation tomorrow in Southern California, but we're stopping in Salt Lake. I'm gonna see Ben and his partner, Marina, and it's gonna be announced on next Friday on my birthday that I'm gonna have representation through the gallery that he now runs. They're in the process. They were in London. The gallery is functioning in London. It's moving to LA. But like we have plans for my work to go to art fairs. We're working on other exhibitions at other spaces, and Ben is now going to be my so-called gallerist with, you know, a contract behind that. And I'm 10 years older than Ben. Like he's like totally on the pulse of what's happening in the art world, and I'm kind of like, well, this is my experience running galleries. You know, like these are the artists that I like that are older than me. So like we have this really great like mentor-mentee like relationship where we're both learning and supporting each other. So yeah, back to your question, that's how. It's just a person in my community that asked me, you know, if he could support an exhibition, and that's really how it happened. that space in Leipzig is like run by a bunch of old punk rockers there. Like it's people that I get along with, that I know what I'm walking into and I know what that space is. It's not like I walked into like some high-end gallery and signed all these contracts. It felt very natural to be there. So thank you. Shelley,
Happy early birthday.
thank you, I appreciate that.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, should we go down to the exhibition? Yeah. Okay.